Please be seated. Last week, we spent time with an encounter in the beginning of the first chapter of Mark, where Jesus encounters an unclean spirit in the synagogue. And what's interesting is that this unclean spirit is the one who identifies Jesus as the Holy One of God, the Messiah. Only the second entity to say that. The first is God. And we wondered whether, since unclean might mean wild as much as or more than it means evil, if the writer of Mark is also giving us a little signal that Jesus might be kind of wild too. And we need to know that as we're reading through this gospel, and need to know that as we're following as disciples. And so we'll just kind of keep that in our minds this summer and today as we're walking through these parables. Now, I want to tell some of the backstory to get us from chapter 1 to chapter 4 and the parables. So after Jesus encounters the unclean spirit, he starts healing, and he heals a man with a leper, touches him. Heals a paralytic, touches him. Brings these outcasts in. Heals all sorts of people. Is casting out spirits one after another. So much so his fame kind of gets out of control, and he just can't go out by himself anymore. He's like a movie star now, like the president. He's just got lots of people around him all the time. Then by the middle of chapter 2, he's getting into scraps with the Pharisees. And they're getting kind of mad at him because he's eating with tax collectors and sinners, and they get in fights about the Sabbath. The disciples are caught picking grain on the Sabbath to make a meal for themselves. And Jesus is in the synagogue on the Sabbath. There's a man with an unclean, or a withered hand. And Pharisees like, "Are you going to heal him?" "Dare you?" And Jesus is like, "Okay." Heals him. And then the Pharisees decide they're going to destroy him from that. They're furious. Sheesh. Then there's this really crazy little story that comes after in chapter 3. Jesus goes home, which must be to Capernaum, I guess. And the disciples go too. And the crowd mobs them, and they're so thick that Jesus and the disciples can't even eat. And then the people start saying he's going crazy. So either Jesus has some sort of Britney Spears-like meltdown, or they are hearing his message and what he's doing, and they're putting it together and like, this is nuts. This is crazy. He's losing his mind. And his family hears that, and they go out to to contain him. They come on, Jesus, let's go home, honey. We'll have some soup. You'll feel better in the morning. It's funny, but it's Jesus. I mean, this is the Holy One of God. It's the Messiah. And people are saying he's crazy? But let's recap. I mean, he healed the leper, touched him. He didn't do that. Healed the paralytic, eaten with tax collectors and sinners. He's just breaking open the boundaries of unclean and clean, of in and out. He's just bringing chaos in everywhere. Religious rules are just being kind of thrown around. And then he goes after the Sabbath. Now, the Sabbath in ancient Israel isn't just like picking up an extra shift at Walmart on Sunday. I mean, this is the heart of the faith. You didn't do anything on the Sabbath because Pharaoh made you work every single day, all the time. And part of the deal in God's deliverance from Egypt is that you got the Sabbath, one day, where you didn't have to do anything. No phone calls, no emails, no pagers, no nothing, no work, no going, nothing. And so many people's eyes, anything on the Sabbath is back on that slippery slope towards Pharaoh. What are you doing, Jesus? People might be saying. And it could be that Jesus' family just wasn't on board. They heard what he's doing. They're like, well, he's crazy. What's he doing? We got to stop him. And that might explain Jesus' response at the end of chapter 3, which isn't very nice. Jesus' family shows up, and the disciples say, "Hey, Jesus, your mom's here." And he says, "Well, who is my mother and my brother?" I mean, you can just hear the crowd gasping, what did he say? Meaning, they're not really with me. I'll tell you who's my mother and my brother. Anyone who does the will of God, and it's not really my family. Dude, Jesus, it's your mom. Is he wild? Oh, maybe. And then we have chapter 4, the parables. Listen, Jesus says, a sower goes out to sow. Some falls on the path, and the birds come and just eat it up. And then some falls in rocky soil, and it sprouts right away, but there's no depth of soil, and it withers as soon as the sun comes out. dies. And then some falls in the thorns, and it grows, but the thorns just choke it out, and it never yields any grain. And then there's the good soil, and some falls in the good soil, and it grows, and it yields 30, 60, 100-fold more than you can imagine. There's argument within the church about what this parable means. For some, it means be good soil. Be good soil. Don't be the rocky soil. Don't be the thorny soil. Be good soil. Here we go. Let's be good soil. And others say, how do you be good? How can you be good soil? We're just who we are. We're created. It's who we are. And we're always going to be rocky. We're always going to be thorny. There's got to be more grace here than that. That just doesn't fit. Well, as I have been reading this in the context of the rest of the Gospel of Mark, it seems like it's about evangelism or about telling the story. And it's hard for me to separate it from what may have been happening in Mark's community at the time. So, for instance, in chapter 3, Jesus appoints the apostles, the 12. An apostle means sent out. And then in chapter 6, these apostles are actually sent out, and they share the good news, and they cast out demons. In chapter 4, the parable seems to be like in the middle of those two episodes. And we have to know that the Gospels are always doing two things at the same time. They're always telling the story of Jesus, and they're also, the writers are also speaking to issues in their particular community that need to be addressed. So that are happening 40 years after the life of Jesus. So for instance, if I was to write a gospel today using that method, I would tell the story of Jesus, but I would also take some opportunities for my Jesus to address particular thorny issues for our church right now, or the church as a whole. So maybe Jesus would address homosexuality, for instance, or maybe Jesus would address building repair and budgets and stuff like that. Okay? It seems like you can hear some questions of Mark's church behind this parable, especially behind the explanation of the parable. And the questions seem to be something like this. So, why is it when we do everything we're supposed to do, we tell the story, we're out there sharing the good news, nothing happens? Why is it that nothing happens? I mean, a little bit happens, but come on, we tell the story. It's the good news of God. It's what we've given our lives to. We're so excited about it. We tell the story, and people just look at us with blank faces. Or some will get excited. A few people get excited. They get really enthused. It's like they get it. And then the Roman soldiers come by and they say, well, where's your allegiance? Is it to Caesar or to Jesus? And they say, well, it's to Caesar. My brother died because when the soldiers came, he said, no, my God is Jesus, not Caesar. And they call themselves Christians. And then some don't share their possessions. Some don't serve the poor. Some are still pursuing worldly desires and achievements. I don't get it. What's going on? And then we have Jesus' explanation, and it seems to address some of these things. The sower sows the word, Jesus says, the word of God. And some falls on the path, and Satan comes and gets that. And that's like the seed that just never gets anywhere. It doesn't seem even to hit the ears. And then there's the rocky soil, and those are the people. They get all excited, but the seed doesn't have a chance to take root. And when persecutions come, challenges come, then they fade away or flee. And then there's the thorns. And those are the people that are so tangled up in the cares of the world that the seed just can't do anything. But then Jesus goes beyond that to what's hopeful. And Jesus says, but then there's the good soil. And all God needs is just a little good soil. And it gets in the ground. And it grows. And it bears grain. It yields 30, 60, 100-fold more than you can imagine. It takes over. It takes over what we see. It takes over everything we do. It just takes over. It's God's love and power and restorative work that we're participating in. And it's powerful. We have to be patient, but we need to be hopeful because it does indeed multiply.